Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week, we're going to be taking a look at an is-it instant and sorcery-based kind of Prowess deck. It's going to be quite an all-in strategy as well, so let's have a look at the deck anyway. So, what do we mean? Well, we're going to be using a lot of creatures with the keyword Prowess, which says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until the end of the turn. So we've got a fair bit of Prowess as well. But we've also got Enigma Drake, which is the build-around card for the deck. So Enigma Drake's power and toughness is, is equal to the number of instants and sorceries in our graveyard. So we run a hell of a lot of instants and sorceries to make sure this guy is massive with the 4 toughness as well. He's kind of hard to remove short of just straight-up hardcaster removal. And then we've also got our Mercurial Geists that get +3/+0 for instants and sorceries. Once we've managed to make them really huge, then we'll fling them at our opponent, essentially dealing double damage, or even using Insult, which literally gives them double damage. So that's kind of the battle plan. Let's go to the beginning of the deck. We've got 2 copies of Rush of Adrenaline. Rush of Adrenaline is a 1 red instant speed. Target creature gets +2/+1 and gains trample until the end of the turn. So if we have to push through our opponent's stuff, most of our creatures are already evasive as well. They are flyers for the most part. The only exception to that is Thing in the Ice for the Awoken Horror, but the Awoken Horror bounces things as well, so there's likely to be nothing in its way when it goes in for that 7 damage, but everything else is flying, so we don't really need to focus too much on the evasive side of our cards, which is why we're running only 2 copies of this and 3 instead of Titan Strength. It's not terribly important that we give it trample, but it is that extra little bit of evasion that might be relevant later down the line. Next we've got Titan Strength, so for 1 red mana, instant speed, target creature gets +3/+1 until the end of the turn, and then we get to scry 1. So scry 1 allows us to look at the top card of our library. If we like it, we keep it. If we don't, we stick it on the bottom. And this just allows us to hit our land drops more consistently, or not at all, to avoid flooding, that kind of thing. It's also really huge in terms of the power buff as well. So if you imagine with either a fling or an insult, this essentially deals double damage. This is like +6 damage as far as our creatures are concerned. Plus, of course, the Prowess trigger on our Stormchaser mages means that this is going to deal a lot of damage, and the scry allows us to potentially cantrip with future cards into better cards. Speaking of cantrips, we've got Expedite. So for 1 red mana, instant speed, target creature gains haste until the end of the turn and draw a card. So drawing a card essentially means that it always redraws itself. So this is 1 red mana to give something haste and draw a card, which keeps our hand quite filled with instants and sorceries, but also sticks 1 in the graveyard as well for the Enigma Drake. Turn 4, we can Enigma Drake, give it haste, cantrip into something else, maybe start throwing loads of instants and sorceries into our graveyard and get the Enigma Drake quite huge. So Expedite's really good for that kind of thing. It can really help us hit our opponent for quite a fair bit of damage out of nowhere. We then have Galvanic Bombardment, so this is one of our removal spells. So for 1 red mana, instant speed, Galvanic Bombardment deals X, where X is the number of Galvanic Bombardments in your graveyard +2, essentially. So it does 2 damage, then it does 3 damage, then it does 4 damage. So it'll allow us to kill quite a fair bit of things. We are an all-in strategy, so it's not terribly important that we have the 4th copy in here, because hopefully we'll have killed our opponent's roadblocks and we'll have won by then. We really don't want to be at a point where we're having to use a Galvanic Bombardment because something with 5 toughness is in the way. That probably won't end up happening, and it's not something we really want to see. But having more in the graveyard really helps us, and having plenty in our hand is also useful as well. So there's that kind of instants and sorcery in the graveyard synergy, but there's also the synergy with plenty of instants in our hand to trigger Prowess, so it's really cool for that kind of thing. Next we've got Slip Through Space. So for 1 blue mana, sorcery speed, target creature can't be blocked this turn. So give a creature unblockable and draw a card. Yet again, it's a cantrip, so it replaces itself, which might draw us into one of our other 1 mana spells to trigger Prowess off of that. Just gives something unblockable yet again, kind of like the Rush of Adrenaline gives trample to get past creatures. This just gives us unblockable, so we can just not get blocked at all. It's pretty sweet for that kind of thing. We then have Thing in the Ice. So Thing in the Ice is a 1 and a blue, 0/4 creature with Defender. It enters the battlefield with 4 ice counters on it, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, remove an ice counter from it, and then if there are no ice counters, you can transform it. So we have a lot of really cheap spells that we can chain into each other. So it's really easy for us to flip Thing in the Ice in this deck. And when we do, we get ourselves a 7/8 Awoken Horror. And when it transforms, it bounces all non-horror creatures to their owner's hands. That is pretty much every single creature in this format gets bounced. It does include our own, unfortunately, but we will be hitting with a 7/8. And if we've been putting pump spells onto our creatures as well, onto our Thing in the Ice to trigger it, then we might be hitting for a little bit more than 7 damage there. And it's just something that's so hard for our opponent to deal with the power and toughness right there. That hard casted removal is the best option. It's just going to be getting in for a stupid amount of damage, most likely, which is essentially what most of our creatures are going to end up doing. Speaking of, we've got Storm Chaser Mage. So for blue and a red, we've got a 1/3 Flying Haste with Prowess. So as we mentioned, Prowess gives +1/+1 to a creature for each non-creature spell. So when we pump up our creature with Expedite, it gets +1/+1. When we get Titan Strength on a Storm Chaser Mage, it actually gets +4/+2 in that sense. So we can really push through a lot of damage. The haste is stupidly good with Storm Chaser Mage as well. It can just win us the game out of nowhere. And if we get to the point where Storm Chaser Mage is up to maybe 5 or 10 power, if we can get it that far, and we can fling it at our opponent, we could maybe instant kill our opponent if we haven't dealt damage up to that time with either the fling or the insult, which is pretty sweet. We then have Telling Time. Telling Time is the early game form of trying to find some of our heftier win conditions. So for 1 and a blue, instant speed, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand, 1 on the top of your library, and 1 on the bottom of your library. So we can find creatures if our opponent keeps removing them. We can find the fling combo if we want to throw one of our big creatures at our opponent. Or we can simply find our land drops in the early game as well, because we do really want to get up to 3 mana is a nice sweet spot with this deck. Of course, there are later game drops as well that we do want to make pretty early if we can. But for the most part, it's just to hit our land drops in the early game to find our 1 mana spells that we can chain on Prowess creatures and stuff like that. So, Fling is one of the win cons of the deck. So for 1 and a red, instant speed, as an additional cost to cast Fling, sacrifice a creature. So the idea for Fling is that we want to be sacrificing one of our big Prowess creatures, probably more specifically the Enigma Drake or the Mercurial Geists, because these two can get absolutely huge. So let's run through it, because Fling deals damage equal to the sacrifice creature's power to target creature or player. So if we manage to get Enigma Drake onto the field and it survives, chances are it's going to be like a 7 or an 8 in power. So we swing for that 7 or 8. After we've done that, we use Fling to essentially double its damage at the cost of sacrificing it. So this could just win on the spot with the Enigma Drake. It's pretty sweet. Same goes for the Mercurial Geists as well. Being able to put +3/+0 on Mercurial Geists means that it will, with all of our 1 mana spells, we can give it +3/+0, plus of course the pump spells on some of them as well. Can really chain a creature to a massive size to just hit in one shot and kill. Next we've got Take Inventory. So for 1 and a blue, this is our card draw for the deck. Sorcery speed, draw a card, then draw cards equal to the number of cards named Take Inventory in your graveyard. So the first one is a cantrip, so a 2 mana draw a card. Then it's 2 mana draw 2 cards, 2 mana draw 3 cards, 2 mana draw 4 cards. Can really get out of hand as well. And we tend to chain into Take Inventories quite easily as well, since we will be cantripping with Expedites and stuff like that. It's very easy to find future Take Inventories, and then when it's a 2 mana drawing 3 or 4, you're getting stupid amount of value. So when we run out of steam maybe in the late game, then we find ourselves a Take Inventory and refill our hand in no time at all. So next we've got Enigma Drake. We briefly touched upon this. 1 a blue and a red for a X4 creature, and its power is equal to the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. So we are chaining instants and sorceries, which allow us to find more that we cast and over and over and over and over again. So Enigma Drake, very high possibility for a high power on this creature, so we can swing over the top and our opponent can't do much about it. 4 toughness is really useful as well. It dodges quite a fair bit of burn in the format. It dodges Fatal Push, but hard caster removal, like Unlicensed Disintegration, and maybe board wipes like Languish and stuff like that. It doesn't dodge, but being able to avoid a fair bit of removal in the format is really good for Enigma Drake. and it's not something that the Mercurial Geists can actually do, but Mercurial Geists can actually get a lot bigger, depending on the board state and your hand. Next, we've got Fevered Visions. This is our way of keeping our hand full again. Yet again, a little bit of card draw, but it's also burn for us as well to keep Planeswalkers in check, or even to get our opponent low enough down to a life total where Enigma Drake can just one-shot our opponent. Or it could just be to draw cards as well to make sure that we're constantly full on instants and sorceries. So at the beginning of each player's end step, that player draws a card. If the player is your opponent and has 4 or more cards in hand, deals 2 damage to him or her, which we can redirect to a Planeswalker. Really good for the long game, and really good for closing out the game quite fast as well. Mercurial Geists, we have talked about this. This is a 2, a red, and a blue for a 1/3 flyer, so it's got a decent bit of evasion. And instants and sorceries give it +3/+0 when you cast them. Plus, of course, half of our instants and sorceries are also pump spells as well, so you add that to your power on this, and then you can fling it, or even just use Insult to deal double damage, and we can throw it at our opponent for the win. It's pretty sweet. We then have Rise from the Tide, so this is another alternative win condition. Don't really rely on it too much, because Languish and other board wipes can just undo this, but for 5 and a blue sorcery speed, put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield, tapped for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard. As we mentioned with the Enigma Drake, there's a good chance when it's going to kill our opponent, it's at about 7/4 or something like that. Which means, on the same token, with a Rise from the Tides, that could be 7 2/2s, which is also a fair amount of damage to throw at your opponent, and if they don't have a board wipe, they can just lose to it on the spot, which is pretty sweet. Next, we've got Insult to Injury. So for 2 and a red, sorcery speed, damage cannot be prevented this turn, and if a source you control would deal damage this turn, double it instead, which means that our Mercurial Geists actually start dealing double damage. So upon casting an Insult with a Geist on the field, you're actually dealing 8 damage just off that spell alone. With the Enigma Drake, it's completely up to how many instant and sorcery cards you have in your graveyard, so it's going to also deal double. And then our Galvanic Bombardments are dealing double as creature removal. Our pump spells are now doubles, so that's like +6/+2. Really awesome spell. Goes really well with this kind of synergy. So that's essentially the deck. It's quite a simple deck. We've forgot about Injury as well. 2 and a red. It's got Aftermath, which means you can cast it from the graveyard. Injury deals 2 damage to target creature and 2 damage to target player. If you've cast Insult that turn, then it's 4 damage to a creature and 4 damage to a player. So we can use it to either close out the game, or we can use it to clear the board in certain ways so that we can push through our Geists. So that is essentially the deck. Onto the mana base, it's pretty simple. We're running 20 lands because we don't really want to hit land drops off of our cantrips. We want to chain into instants and sorceries. And for the most part, 20 seems to be quite the nice little sweet spot for us at the moment. Makes it kind of difficult to cast Rise from the Tides, but other than that, there's not really any problems. We've got 7 islands and 7 mountains because we've got quite the fine balance of instants and sorceries, and we want both mana costs on turn 1 and turn 2 as well. So we want to be on turn 2 having a red and a blue source available, turn 3 having at least 1 red or blue source available with a backup one as well. We then have Wandering Fumarole. Enters the battlefield tapped, adds blue or red to our mana pool, so it is a dual mana land. But it also has the ability to turn into a creature that is a 1/4 blue and red elemental creature, and you can switch the power and toughness until the end of the turn. So it can actually be a 1/4 or a 4/1. So this can be used after our opponent has a lot of creature removal, maybe. They tap out. We can hit them for 4 if they've got no creatures on the board. Sulphur Falls enters the battlefield tapped unless you control an island or a mountain. We've got a lot of basics, so that is likely to come into play untapped on turn 2, which is pretty sweet. And then we have Evolving Wilds as well. This is just to thin out our deck, because as I mentioned, we don't really want to hit land drops. We want to get to about 3 or 4 mana and stay there for the most part. So Evolving Wilds allows us to get whichever basic we want and thin out our deck as well to reduce the odds of drawing into new cards. That is the deck. If you do enjoy the look of the deck, then be sure to check out the matches that should be already out as well. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for some more Magic Duels. So long as you guys keep supporting Magic Duels as well. If you haven't heard that Magic Duels is actually no longer being supported so long as the views keep on coming in and I can see that you guys still enjoy the content that I put out, I will endeavour to put out as much content as possible for the foreseeable future. So liking and subscribing and leaving just a normal view watching the video is absolutely perfectly good support for that. So if you can do that, then be sure to do that. And don't forget to hit that little bell icon as well, and that'll give you notifications when the next videos go live. I do hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the matches. Bye bye.